On today's Locked On Jayhawks, the biggest decisions to be had for KU football in a very important offseason, including what do you do at QB1?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Derek Johnson, you can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. Blue Sky, Derek Johnson. This is Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. Thank you to the first listeners every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every show. And on today's edition, we're going to be discussing the biggest decisions that KU football needs to have during the offseason, including the defense coordinator spot, at the quarterback one spot with Jalon Daniels. Do they have enough to bring him back? Does he want to come back? All that sort of stuff on today's episode of the show. Plus, we'll get to a little KU football recruiting update because KU football lost a player to Memphis. KU football added a transfer who was committed to Memphis. They lost a JUCO commit. They added a 2026 commit. Plenty to talk about on today's show, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase with Game Time. All right, let's start with the players. We'll get into the coaches in our second segment, and then we'll finish up with that KU football recruiting update here. I think the biggest one is Jalon Daniels. Obviously, what does KU do with Jalon Daniels? Now, I think before the season started, the idea from the Jalon Daniels side of things was to ball out, have the season that you would hope to be having, and go off to the NFL. And, you know, have a great season as a team, have a great season individually, and walk off into the sunset. And that would have been a great finish for, I think, every party involved. Unfortunately, we saw Jalon in the early portion of the season, whether it was him shaking rust off from the injuries and, you know, not getting to play as much during like spring ball and fall camp where they hadn't established that rhythm and chemistry with the receivers and all that stuff, whether it was that chemistry or lack thereof with the offensive coordinator, the new play caller, because you're not getting out there, whether it was Jeff Grimes adjusting, whether it was Jalon just struggling for whatever reason early in the season and then refining his rhythm. For whatever reason, it just wasn't the same. And how much you want to put on the coordinator, how much you want to put on the player. I don't know that we're ever going to get a full answer of what exactly went wrong there. But things picked up in a big way for Jalon Daniels. I guess you could say over the back half of the season, but I think it really extended for more than that. I mean, when you look at it, you could point to maybe 7 or 8 games, the final 7 games maybe for Jalon Daniels, where he really started to figure things out. And he started to look like the old guy you're accustomed to. Now, it wasn't the best finish you were hoping for. He threw those 2 interceptions against Baylor, both of which were interceptions that reminded you of the first portion of the season. But I mean, overall, he was still better in that Baylor game than he was in a lot of the games earlier in the season. And it was reflected in the stats. You look at the back half of the season, you look at the total QBR, like game log of games in and out. It was just much better over the back half of the season. And he was excellent in some key wins for you down the stretch. He was excellent in the Colorado game. I know it was the Devin Neal game, but in the moments you needed him to make a play, he came through with those. Like, he was really good in the K-State game outside of the key fumble, obviously, at the end there. He was really good in the Iowa State win. I mean, he was throwing it all over the field, right? There are other games that I can point to as well. Basically, the point being, when you look at, and I tweeted this out, the top seasons by total QBR by Kansas quarterbacks. So QBR is a ESPN metric. It's on a scale of 0 to 100. And it goes back to 2004 from the college football level. You look at the best seasons by total QBR of KU quarterbacks, it's like Jalon Daniels, Jason Bean, Todd Reesing. Like, you look at the top 10, there's that one Carter Stanley season that's thrown in there. But Jalon Daniels, even this season, after the slow start, has one of those top 10. I think it's 6th in on the list. He also has 2 of the top 4 if he would have qualified based on what he did in short sample sizes in 2022 and 2023. And also the 2021 season would be up there as well in his limited playing time there. So point being, this is a guy who has consistently shown he can be one of the best quarterbacks that your school has had that in the past couple of decades, that the conference is. And I mean, he still finished in a year where, again, you had the slow start. He still is, I think, 43rd nationally this year in total QBR. So you have basically this year on the total body of work an above average quarterback. But if you just take the final portion of the season, he was once again really good Jalon Daniels. And you would hope with another offseason with the same coordinator, you know, getting through the full season healthy for the first time, which that's a huge deal, you know, getting to then therefore have a healthy spring and everything as you'd hope. You would think that he'd be primed for an even bigger year next season. But this is an interesting decision because it's not just about what Kansas wants, it's about what Jalon Daniels wants. Now, I guess you could say that about everything. Like, it's always a two-way street, right? But I think in a more real way in this one, because Jalon Daniels is going to have a lot of options. If he I don't think the NFL option is going to be there this year. I think for him, it's going to come down to, do I find a better college option? And by better, that could refer to a couple things. Are you looking for more NIL money? Now, the overall stats on the season, is he going to get more NIL money on the open market than he was getting at Kansas? Is he going to get the same NIL money he was getting at Kansas this past year for the future season? Is the price going to have to get upped to avoid that sort of thing on the transfer market? Or is the price going to go down all the way around? I don't know. Is Kansas just going to match what they did last year and he's going to have to try to get more, right? The NIL game becomes a key part in this. How is that going to play into it? But also from Jalon's perspective, he sees all these seniors graduating. Is he going to view it as, I have a better chance to ball out and have a great season somewhere else? Or is he going to view it as, I want to finish my career here at Kansas? Even though there's going to be a lot of new players, Kansas is going to be bringing in a lot of transfer portal talent that, could still lead to being a really good team this year. And there's been some really good young players that have been brought in by the Lance Leipold staff that could be ready to break out, even if they haven't totally shown it on the field or haven't got the opportunity to show it, that he still thinks this team's going to be good, right? And so for Kansas, then that's the Jalon Daniels side. From the Kansas perspective, from Lance Leipold's perspective, it's, how ready do you feel Isaiah Marshall is? Do you feel that Jalon Daniels coming back for another year could lead to Isaiah Marshall transferring? How ready do you think David McComb would be? He's going to join the team early in spring ball, but that's still not going to be able to know by then. How ready do you think Cole Ballard is? Do you think none of those guys are going to be ready enough to be the starter, where you need Jalon Daniels back, and that could impact how much NIL you're properly placing on it? Or do you view it as, if you're Kansas and say, hey, you feel comfortable with what Isaiah Marshall can bring, we'd rather have that extra NIL money to go out and get, a stud receiver and a good offensive lineman or something like that, right? That's a possibility too. But only Lance Leipold knows, because we didn't really get to see Cole Ballard or Isaiah Marshall on the field. And so I think, that's something that Lance Leipold, Jim Zabrowski, Jeff Grimes are going to have a better read on, of how ready is, because Isaiah Marshall, I think, is going to be a really good player for KU. He still might not be ready, right? He might not be ready to be a starter till 2026 or 2027. You don't know. Guys, develop at different levels. So that's going to be a key part. How do both parties kind of view each other? And that's probably the biggest one for KU. Spent a lot of time on that one. Let's get to some other ones. DeShawn Hanika. Now, this isn't a decision in theory of like, is he going to go pro early or something? This is just, does DeShawn Hanika want to continue his career? Coming off, I believe it was, I don't know if they ever fully released exactly what the injury was. I think the talk was that it was an Achilles injury, out for the year. Takes a lot of rehab to come back from an Achilles. Sometimes guys aren't ever fully the same. So for DeShawn Hanika, does he want to come back off a season-ending injury and play that final season of college football he was hoping that this year would be? And does he end up being the guy? And not only that, but if you're Kansas, do you view it as, okay, if he wants to come back, we go into it fully expecting him to be the guy at tight end, because they were expecting him to be the starter this year. And I think Jeff Grimes wants more receiving options at tight end, which Hanika filters more into. But does Kansas say, hey, even if you are coming back, we're not sure how you're going to come back from a really devastating injury. We're still going to bring somebody else in. But still, that impacts, does Kansas go after one guy in the portal? Do they go after two guys in the portal? That could be impacted by the DeShawn Hanika decision. Couple big ones on the offensive line. Logan Brown. So I haven't seen any mock drafts with Logan Brown going, but I think when some of these NFL scouts and evaluators study the tape a little bit more, see the season that was produced by Logan Brown, a former 5-star recruit, he was the third highest graded offensive tackle in the entirety of the Big 12. He was the 8th highest graded offensive tackle in the entirety of Power 4, according to Pro Football Focus. I have a hard time believing that guy doesn't get on the radars of people wanting to draft guys. And so, I kind of think that if he did come out, he would eventually be either a day 3 draft pick, or at the very least, if he is undrafted, like sometimes that can be crapshoots there with that, he would be a priority undrafted free agent pickup. I think he's done enough this season. Now, the question there with Logan Brown is, does he want to come back? If he has another baller season like that now with more accolades and notoriety to him, maybe he does become, with his prospect pedigree and size, a 3rd rounder or something like that if he comes back and produces again with another good year of college. That's entirely possible. And so there's a real reason for him to come back there. That said, he's been in college for 5 years already, between his 3 years at Wisconsin, 2 at Kansas. Maybe he's done with school. Maybe he's like, you know what? I don't want to have a 6-year college. I'm ready to move on. Even if I am undrafted, I'm cool starting in the NFL. That'll be a big decision, but he had an excellent season for KU. It would be a huge boon if they could bring him back. Bryce Foster. He's somebody who I've seen ranked inside the top 400, seen as a possible day 3 pick right now. He was the 4th highest graded center on Pro Football Focus in the Power 4. So I think, again, you're looking at a guy on review, if he enters his name in the draft, is going to rise up than more of where you're seeing him right now, which is in that like 300 range, where I would imagine he'd be a day 3 pick. Obviously, with centers, you're not going as high in the NFL draft, but this is where I think the track stuff comes into play. We heard a lot about, that was a big part of his decision. He wanted to do track and field in addition to football. Well, if he goes off to the NFL draft, he's not really going to be doing the track and field stuff. He's going to be getting ready for the draft. And so that almost makes me think that maybe it becomes more likely he would come back so he could have that track and field season and have that extra, final year of track and field, or maybe even 2, because he could have another year after that. And then maybe he does, but it is a decision for him because he does have potential for the NFL. And that would be another big addition if Kansas can bring him back, because he also had an excellent season. Should I throw in Dean Miller to the player list? Because KU has lost their top pass rusher every year in the Lance Leipold era for the following season. So maybe it's worth a discussion, but even though Dean Miller led him in sacks, number 21 defensive end on Pro Football Focus in the Big 12, not that that's gospel, but it at least gives you a range that I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. So I would expect him back. Obvious disclaimer for not just all of these players, but every player on the roster, because this applies now in today's day and age of college athletics, but every player across every roster, every player has a decision. Every coach has a decision with every player. Do you want to force him out and bring in somebody else, right? Do you want to, if you're the player, transfer and find greener pastures, whether that's greener pastures, the money way of looking at it, or in terms of greener pastures of looking for our playing time, right? So everybody has a decision to make. Kansas has a decision to make on everybody, but those are, I think, the biggest ones that you're looking at here that are not because again, you can apply that to every player and be like, well, is he going to transfer? Is he going to come back, right? So it's not worth worrying about until it actually happens. But those are the ones with, I think, big decisions for possibly pro decisions, or in the case of Jalon, like, does he want to transfer? Does he want to come back because it's such a high profile thing? Let's get to the coaches. You've probably been waiting for some Brian Borland talk. So let's get to that on the other side. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Our episode today is brought to you by Game Time, which is a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. You get seat views on the app where you can have a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you even buy. And as you tilt it around, you can see, oh, there's the sky, there's the field, there's the 50-yard line, right? They also have their lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. That's all one word. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, continuing on. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. Check out, for your second listen, our bonus episode, KU adding Leshon Williams. We'll get into more recruiting stuff here in our third segment. And check out Locked On College Football, Locked On College Basketball for your, second, third, fourth listen, whatever it is, right here with the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, big coaches' decisions to be had as well. Let's get to Brian Borland. So not a great finish for Brian Borland in the Baylor game to kind of finish out the season. And when you look at the overall stats for the season, this year is pretty similar in certain ways to last year. Last year, they gave up 26.5 points per game. This year, they actually gave up less at 26. But the national ranking is actually worse because I guess just, there was, less scoring in college football this year. But if you look at yards allowed per play, this one is closer to the 2022 defense, as the 2023 defense was 74th in yards allowed per play. This one was 104th. The 2022 was 120th. So it feels like you plateaued a bit this year. Brian Borland, I believe his contract is up at the end of the season, so they'd have to renew him. And that's part of it too. You don't have to pay a buyout if you let him go. Now, Brian Borland has been a longtime coordinator and friend of Lance Leipold. And, for the longest time, I was very much that I thought there was a bad rap there. You saw the defense improving, and, once he had more time, it would work well. You look back to the Buffalo years, majority of the time, the defense actually outperformed the offense at Buffalo. But I think you look back now, and maybe that had more to do with, his scheme fit better against maybe MAC offenses than it does in maybe Big 12 offenses, and struggling against teams who run tempo and have really good athletes, right? Think about the teams who had a ton of speed that they struggled with, right? You didn't have that as much in the MAC. And so you look at it, and I think Brian Borland did a good job making this defense get better each and every year until, last year to this year where it's been kind of that plateau. But I think it's time to move forward and find somebody else, in my opinion. And it just makes a lot of sense that he is getting older. He had that, I think it was like a heart procedure or something, or health procedure a season ago. So maybe it would make sense to, go in a different direction and have a retiring and a mutual kind of splitting of ways. And again, I appreciate Brian Borland. He was always good for press conferences because he was never as I don't know, a star with his words as like Andy Kotelnicki was, for instance. But there was actually a lot of details you could take from it. He was very descriptive, and I appreciated that in a real way. And he was upfront in a lot of ways about that. And I appreciated that. And like I said, I think you give him credence for helping this defense improve each and every year. But it feels like now you've hit that precipice where it's like, yeah, time to move another direction of somebody who, do you bring in somebody who has one of these newer formations like the 3-2-6s or the 4-2-5s that's a little more new age and can get a little bit more out of some of these guys. So we'll see what ends up happening there, but I think it would make a lot of sense to move in another direction. But like I said, he's been a longtime coach with Lance Leipold, knew and understand Lance, who has typically kept continuity in the coaching staff and is stuck with the guys he trusts. So we'll see what ends up happening there. As far as Jeff Grimes, I don't really think this is a conversation because I don't think that would be the right thing to do to get rid of Jeff Grimes. And listen, this is even coming from me, which middle of the season, we had the conversations like about Jalon Daniels, Jeff Grimes. Did you need to make a change? I think at one point in the middle of the season, we said they should make a change. And I think at one point during the season, I kind of said, I think the first change they should make is they should try out Jim Zebrowski as the play caller before they change the quarterbacks to see, what kind of your testing hypothesis there was. And turns out that the offense ended up being fine in the second half in Big 12 only games. Kansas led the conference in yards per play. Now, you could make a real argument that was despite, some at times shady play calling or decisions, and that the reason they led the conference in yards per play was more about the personnel, with Devin Neal and Quentin Skinner making great catches and Luke Grimm making key plays and Jalon starting to come into his own in the second half of the season. But I don't think it was that big of an issue. Like, the offense was good over the second half of the season for KU. And he's under contract 2 more years, right? That's buyout money that if you were to let him go, that would be money that is not now going to other coaching staff moves or going to possibly NIL or players that you want to bring into the program. And so again, the offense was legitimately good over the final 7 or 8 games. And maybe it just took Jeff Grimes some time to get accustomed to the personnel and the way Kansas did things and infusing some of the Kansas, stuff that they wanted to do. And to where, yes, there were certain criticisms, obviously, of Jeff Grimes over the back half of the season still, but I thought the play calling was a lot better over those back half. Now, how much of that is chicken and egg, the results versus the process, I don't entirely know, but he did more than enough. Again, number 1 in yards per play in Big 12 only games. You don't let that guy go after 1 year. I think he's earned more time for sure. Now, the other question, do we see any changes at position coach levels for KU? I don't know which ones it would be. I don't know that any of them are have their contracts up, going to the idea of the buyouts. And again, Lance Leipold wanting to keep consistency with those guys. Maybe you would look at and say, like, yeah, it feels like they're not really getting much from the receiver room in terms of the recruits they've tried to bring in. And now with all these seniors graduating, do you need a fresh face there? Linebacker group has struggled, but also you've gotten it seems like a good little Detroit pipeline in partial because of the linebacker coach. So it seems like he's done a good job on the recruiting trail. And maybe that's just a lack of talent as opposed to, the coach there. Then again, like, how much is that with recruiting and stuff? So I don't know that any position coaches will be changed out unless anybody leaves for another job necessarily. But it'll be interesting to see if they do decide to make any changes after a year last year where they had a lot more moving chairs, so to speak, because of some coaches leaving for other jobs. Let's finish up here. KU football recruiting update. They lost the linebacker, added a 2026 recruit. We'll get to that next. Our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Finishing things up on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, KU football recruiting update. We'll start with the Memphis stuff. We had an episode talking about Leshon Williams, who was a former Iowa running back who committed to Memphis out of the transfer portal. He, about a week later, flipped to Kansas. He'll be a Jayhawk and could be the starting running back next year, ? Well, check out our bonus episode of the show on Leshon Williams. Now, the other side of it, Kansas lost a 2025 high school recruit, Kenyon Rivera, to Memphis. And that's obviously tough because you look at the linebackers and going back to that, that's been a position of need for Kansas really the entirety of the Lance Leipold era. And I think you could argue it's gotten a little bit better each and every year, but there's still leaps and bounds to be made. And anytime you lose somebody at that position, somebody who I thought was a heat-seeking missile on film, like, you don't want to have that happen. Now, I guess it makes you feel a little bit better, though, that it's like he didn't flip to like a Michigan or an Ohio State or something where you're like, oh no, we lost this kid who's being seen as so good that he's going to one of these big time schools. That would have been such a big gift for us. I guess that makes you feel a little bit better there. And it is somewhere that I think Memphis is a lot closer to home for him. So that probably impacted it. So you can understand why it would happen, but obviously not great for Kansas to be losing linebackers at a position of need. Chandavian Bradley, he's a JUCO recruit you might have heard about, defensive end, was previously at Tennessee, then went to the Kansas JUCO ranks. He ended up picking Oklahoma State over Kansas, so one less possible defensive end. But I think it shows you Kansas probably going to be in on defensive ends in the portal. Maybe not plural. Maybe it's defensive end, right? Because you still do have all these young guys like Dak Brinkley, like DJ Warner, like Bai Jobe, who are going to be looking to come into their own and get more playing time next year in their second year at the program. So you don't want to, block all of them from playing time, but does it make sense to bring in maybe one transfer addition? Yeah, it probably does. And I think the fact that they were in that to the very end shows just that. Now for 2026, Kansas added a commit in a 3-star corner in Lennie Brown out of the state of California. He's ranked as a top 600 national recruit, so that's always a nice ranking. I always say top 1,000 for KU football is a solid deal for them. So once you're getting into the top 600, that's an even bigger deal. And the other schools that had offered him are pretty impressive. Arizona, Florida, Penn State, Tennessee. So, this is a pretty big get for KU at the corner position. It seems like Kansas continues to recruit this position really well. Obviously, you're losing Kobe Bryant and Melo Dotson at the end of the season. And there's going to be some questions about how the new corners come into their own next season. But I have decent confidence that they're going to be able to figure that out and be okay there next season, because you look at guys like Jameel Croft and I guess we'll see with Demarius McGee, like his playing time kind of sputtered a little bit at the end of the season, but former highly recruited guy. You look at Jalen Todd, who was getting some real playing time at the end of last season. Like, they have, some really good recruits, some guys who didn't even get on the field this year, like Austin Alexander and Andre Gibson, some former highly really recruited corners who are going to be playing more now. And it feels like they continue to get a nice pipeline from whatever state they've been from, Arizona, California, wherever. They're finding good corners for 2025 and beyond. And they continue that with Lennie Brown. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. Check out the Leshon Williams bonus episode with him committing to Kansas, the transfer running back from Iowa. We'll have Kansas Creighton basketball preview coming at you for Wednesday as well, ahead of that big road game in Omaha. But that'll do it for us today. I'm Derek Johnson. Have a good rest of your day. See you next time with Locked On Jayhawks.